I'm here with Bill Whittle. And look, there's a lot of people who the introduction just doesn't do him justice. This is one of those people, and you're going to find that out as the interview kind of progresses here. He's a writer and director of several excellent American and world history projects. And mostly, I guess, to the average person who may be from the Midwest, you might have heard of What We Saw. And it's a documentary about individuals that grew up during the space race and when Apollo 11 landed. And then the second season is about the Cold War and the tensions that really arose out of the Second World War and how the United States prevailed. And it's excellent for a lot of reasons. But why he's on today is to talk about the third season, which is dropping. And you guys have to hear about it because it's about the rise of the Soviet Union, which initially, I see you guys out there, you're kind of nodding along like you know the rise of the Soviet Union. But I'm going to let you on a little secret. You don't. I don't. Because it's been a long time since 8th grade world history when your teacher glossed over it because it was the end of the year and you remember the names Stalin and Lenin. But Bill's going to help clean that up. Bill, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So the first question, this is one that I get a lot when I've talked to some friends about your series in general, is why do a Cold War and Russia history series in the first place? At a time when President Obama got on the world stage and argued that focusing on the Cold War is like a really 1980s political stance. It's like a very old idea, a very us versus them dichotomy. Why do a this is us thing in the first place?
Well, just to answer the most obvious part of that question is, President Obama in his infinite wisdom assumed that the Cold War is over, and why even study Russia? I mean, it's not like they could invade another country since the Cold War was over. It's not like Russian expansionism or militarism is an issue today in 2024. I mean, you can't possibly understand what Putin is doing in Ukraine without understanding Putin's background, and Putin's background specifically ties to one of the most remarkable stories in Empire of Terror and one of the most remarkable coincidences in history. So just to answer that specific question, Vladimir Lenin was the author of the Bolshevik Revolution. He invented communism as we understand it today, Leninism.
Right.
He was a very reclusive guy, needless to say, very antisocial guy. And so when he moved into a small house outside of Moscow, he had a residence with his wife, his sister. He had 4 bodyguards, 2 secretaries, and a cook. And this cook was named Comrade Spiridon. That was his last name. So Spiridon was the only guy who actually lived with Lenin. He lived in the house and cooked every meal for him. And after Lenin died, it was decided that Spiridon could be trusted because he hadn't poisoned Lenin. So Comrade Spiridon went and lived with Stalin for the duration of Stalin's run as dictator of the Soviet Union. So you got to figure that of all of the people that ever lived in the Soviet Union, this one cook was the guy who was he had the best ringside seat to the rise of the Soviet Union from this agrarian wasteland into this nuclear superpower. Now, Comrade Spiridon's last name was Putin. And Comrade Spiridon Putin, the cook for Lenin and Stalin, the only guy who lived in the house with both of those two men, was Vladimir Putin's grandfather. Now, Spiridon Putin died when Vladimir Putin was 16. But you've got to think about what kind of stories young Vladimir must have heard on the knee of his grandfather talking about the Soviet Union.
And it must have been effective because then Putin goes on to become a KGB agent in Dresden, of all places.
He enlists before he's old enough. They tell him, come back in a year or two, so he does. And as the Soviet Union is falling apart, he's stationed in East Germany, in Berlin. There's a great movie called The Lives of Others where you learn about the German secret police called the Stasi, which is the same as the KGB and the Gestapo. They're all built out of the same materials. Right. But the fact that Vladimir Putin's grandfather was Lenin's personal live-at-home cook and Stalin's personal live-at-home cook. Now this, you may think, oh, wow, I guess that means he really has a great view of the Soviet Union. But what that really means is that all of the people that Stalin murdered over the course of his life, and Lenin too, for that matter, sat at the table and were served by Spiridon Putin until they suddenly disappeared. Here's Yezhov over at the house having dinner, drinking till 4:00 in the morning. The next day, where's Comrade Yezhov? Well, Comrade Yezhov isn't with us anymore. Now, he was shot in the back of the head. Now we have Comrade Beria. And then Comrade Beria is there for 20 years. Where's Comrade Beria? Oh, Comrade Beria is not with us anymore. He was shot in the back of the head. And those are 2 examples out of hundreds. And so if you have a cook who's grown up worshiping a man whose modus operandi, talking about Stalin here specifically, for dealing with problems is to have those people killed
Hmm.
And then that man is the father of Vladimir Putin. What kind of values do you suppose are going to end up in Vladimir Putin's head when it comes to problems?
And that's the linchpin. That, to me, at least from my very limited understanding, has to be one of the key focal points. And again, I haven't seen the script for the show. You're telling me things that I've never known before. I had no idea who
I didn't either.
Putin's parents or grandparents were. But again, a lot of people have asked, why is Putin so fetishistically obsessed with this authoritarian government? It was communism then, it's some kind of pseudo-fascism now. Why has Putin grown into this way? Doesn't he hate the Soviet Union, at least in its oppression, after his lineage? Well, no, because not suffering under communism, his parents and grandparents were under the kid gloves of communism. Like, that in and of itself is the kind of post-historical fact you genuinely don't hear about until usually hundreds of years later.
It's like if we're talking about Christianity, then it would be like Vladimir Putin was raised by Peter, by Christ's greatest disciple, that knew Christ the greatest. You would wonder, well, how come this guy's a Christian? Well, why do you think? Why do you think he thinks like a communist secret policeman? He became head of the FSB. One of the things that we do in the first episode of An Empire of Terror, and I was very clear about this, I wanted this to be a legal case against communism. I wanted it to be a legal case against them. And that meant that my opening statement to the jury had to be a punch in the gut. And so the first chapter of the first episode is called A Modern City, where we get on Google Earth and we just walk around Moscow and we look at buildings that are standing today. Here's the Lubyanka. We're not sure how many, but probably 70,000 people were murdered in the basement of this building. Hey, let's go 2/5 of a mile up a street. See that gate there? This gate belongs to a little courtyard that's still owned by the FSB. If you go behind that gate, you'll find a little courtyard where 14,000 people were shot to death in night, screaming while the engines on the automobiles were revving to silence the sound of the gunfire. Oh, I know. Let's not go north. Let's go south. Here's a building that's about to be turned into a modern perfume store. It's just a regular, typical retail outlet. The Russians at the time called it the shooting house. 36,700 people went into that building, and 36,700 people didn't come out. That's one building that is 2/10 of a mile away from the Lubyanka, which is 300 yards away from the toy store in modern Moscow. So the whole first chapter of the first episode is showing you where the bodies are, because I wanted to come into this thing with the receipts, Tony. I wanted the receipts on the table, and for me to make this case stick, it was critical throughout the entire run of it that I never gave anything that was an opinion. So I didn't want people to say, oh, this just is some right-wing guy's opinion. No, this is what Lenin said. This is what Stalin said. This is what Trotsky said.
That is exactly how I write. That is my exact definitive philosophy in doing the show and working for the Daily Signal and doing my writing. I'm very forensic, because the last thing that I want, again, if there is one thing that my editors will criticize me about, it's that my articles, whenever I write, are filled to the brim with hyperlinks. Because as a former science academic, exactly, there is no opinion of mine unless I openly state this is my analysis of it, that is not based in direct linking fact to what is going on. It's why Indianapolis Public Schools, it took so long to fire me after I exposed critical race theory. I had everything cited down to a T.
Yeah.
And so
problematic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We're on with Bill Whittle, talking about the new season of what we saw, the rise of the terror of the Soviet Union. And
it's called An Empire of Terror.
An Empire of Terror. And when it comes to this empire of terror, and when it comes to the horrors that you're getting ready to dig into as this comes out, a lot of people, again, when I was in school in the aughts, all right, and then when I taught students in the teens, Stalin was really the only focus of our instruction on USSR, right? And then if we even discussed it at all, maybe a little bit of Lenin and Marx, and then it's social studies, right? It's not really history, it's social studies. So we would shift to talking about like modern propaganda, and we would again shift from the actual history. Why cover the terror and those surrounding Stalin in such a greater detail in An Empire of Terror? You said the first episode is a case against communism, but the series
The whole
goes on
series, the whole
after that.
series is a case against communism. All 8 episodes are a legal case against communism. And when I make my closing arguments, I don't think there's a rational person on the earth who could possibly defend this system. I have a line I like an awful lot in the very first episode. I said, now, if you're one of those people that are really determined to defend communism, the single most important thing you can do is understand as little about it as possible. And that's really the truth. Now, here's what really did surprise me, Tony. When I pitched this episode to Daily Wire, I thought I was going to do a 7-part series, one on each of the terror masters. Dzerzhinsky was the first head of the secret police. I would do Dzerzhinsky, Medzinski, I'd do Yezhov, I'd do Yagoda, Beria, I'd drop off in Putin.
Oh, another episode on Beria. If you haven't listened to his second season here on What We Saw, it is the section on Beria genuinely made me believe in the ghosts he talks about for a few minutes. It's horrible.
It's horrific. But here's what genuinely surprised me, because sometimes when you start writing something, especially if it's just something factual, where you've got an idea of how you want to cover this, but then you start actually doing the research, and the research starts taking you in different directions than you originally thought. I thought that this was going to be almost exclusively about Stalin. I thought I'd be done with Lenin by the end of episode 2 and maybe halfway through the episode 2. I didn't finish with Lenin until the end of episode 6. It's hardly about Stalin at all. And the reason is because this is not Stalin's creation. It's Lenin's creation.
Mm-hmm.
Lenin wrote the manual and Stalin followed the instructions. Now, the reason that's important is that the defenders of communism would like to say that Lenin had created this workers' paradise, died early of a stroke, and this monster Stalin came in and ruined everything. Well, this is the argument that, well, they just didn't do it right. Look what communism did in the Soviet Union, killed 20 million people. Yeah, well, they didn't do it right. And my point is, they didn't do it right. And they didn't do it the wrong way. They didn't do it the right way. They did it the only way. Mm-hmm. Lenin created a state where the only person who could succeed him would be the most ruthless murderer in the bunch. That was the only candidate available. And all of these people were bloodthirsty animals who anybody who disagreed with them, their immediate solution was a firing squad.
But it's that point, though, and I don't mean to cut you off midstream.
No, it's
I'm so used to hearing it. You really dive in. What kids are being told today, and I don't just mean today kids, but again, when I was growing up, and it was the CNN Cold War series. That's how the Soviet Union was portrayed. That Lenin had created something, and a lot of people really liked it. That's always how they framed it. A lot of people liked it, and then Stalin came in and he bastardized the whole thing, and he just ruined it for everybody. And in media today, there's an epic rap battles of history YouTube.
I love him.
Absolutely. So you know the one I'm talking about, right? Him. The one with the four or five Russian leaders.
Right.
And they put Lenin up, and then they have Stalin came in, and Lenin's like criticizing Stalin from the grave. You let your heart grow dark and stop the greatest revolution from the birth of Marx. And that's not true, though. Like, Stalin didn't bastardize, he utilized.
I don't know how to put it any more plainly than as I just said. Lenin wrote the manual. Stalin followed the instructions. This state was designed by Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, 100%. He was the absolute architect of the empire of terror, and he knew from the beginning, from before he took power, that in order for this thing to work, we're going to have to kill a lot of people. Lenin said, "What kind of a revolution is this if we don't have firing squads?" Well, it would be the American Revolution for one, but secondly, Lenin was a great student of the French Revolution, and if you really want to get into the roots of the philosophical structure of the Russian Revolution, you've got to understand a little bit of the French Revolution, which happened about 20 years after the American Revolution. But unlike the American Revolution, where there were no hangings, no reprisals, no mass executions, during the French Revolution, if you disagreed with the revolutionaries, somebody could just point a finger at you. J'accuse, I accuse you. And that was the end of your
populism.
life. You're done. You're executed. And so that started something in the French Revolution called the Terror, which eventually became the Great Terror. They were killing 10,000 people a day. And all you had to do was look at somebody. Now, that exact same dynamic repeated itself in the Soviet Union, but it didn't last for 2 or 3 years. It lasted for 70 or 80 years. And when you get down to the mechanics of how a terror state works, I've got 2 stories these are not just individual stories. These are widely reported from thousands of different people. During the Great Terror in 37 and 38, for example, if you lived in Moscow, the secret police would make their arrests usually about 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 or 3 in the morning. The reason they did that was the time that they figured out that you were the most psychologically vulnerable. Human beings, just because of their natural sleep cycle, at around 2 or 3 in the morning are at their lowest. And they wanted to arrest you then for 2 reasons. You're less likely to put up resistance, and you're more likely to be terrified. So the life story of people living in Moscow during the second half of the 30s in Moscow and other cities across the Soviet Union was that you would lie and wake in bed at night until about 2 o'clock in the morning. If you didn't hear a motor car by then, you probably could sleep for a few hours until you had to get up at 6. But more often than not, you would hear these Black Marias, these armored police vans pull up outside your house. And most of these old flats had a single elevator. And the number of people who've told this story is just astronomical. They would lie in bed at night and they could hear the elevator coming up towards where they lived. And they would just they'd feel this icy hand of death just clutch their heart and they couldn't breathe. And when they heard that elevator had passed their floor, then they could relax. Then they could go to sleep. The next day, you would find out that the Something-Kov family has mysteriously disappeared. And nobody knows where they are and nobody says anything. That's half of the equation. But the other half of the equation that nobody really talks about and that you really need to understand how this works. Why did the secret police come and take away the Eneyov family? Well, somebody made a phone call. Somebody just made a phone call. That's all you had to do. You had a blank line at the KGB headquarters, NKVD or OGPU or whatever it was that checked.
Yeah, whatever they were calling themselves.
They kept rebranding themselves because they thought that they could reduce the fear of what they introduced. But somebody would just call and say, I overheard we'll just say Nabokovs, because Nabokovs, among many others, were victimized. I was just living right down 2 doors from the Nabokovs, and I was walking down the hallway, comrade, just doing my Soviet duty to polish the windows, and I heard somebody speaking in French on the telephone. Bye-bye. I heard somebody who had a relative overseas. Bye-bye. And more often than not, the person who was making the call just wanted their apartment. Mm-hmm. Or they wanted their job. Or maybe he liked the way this guy's wife looked. And this kind of petty not even street corner, apartment level rat, this petty fascist, the tiny little dictators that just want power over the immediate 10 or 12 people that they contact every part of their lives. Well, these people suddenly became like gods. Everybody knew that this was the floor snitch. You didn't say anything rude to this person. You got out of their way. There was a woman in Kyiv during the Soviet Union who accused the Ukrainian Communist Party of being too lax on traitors. And they kicked her out of the party because she was a stark raving lunatic. She wrote a letter to Stalin. Stalin flew into towering rage, reinstated her, put her in charge of this committee. This woman would walk down the street. She said she could tell a traitor by the way they looked in the eyes. Oh. And if this woman came into a restaurant, everything would just stop, because it didn't make you safe. It was just the safest thing you could do. If you looked at her, you might be denounced. If you didn't look at her, you might be denounced. If you said something to her, that might be enough to denounce her. If you didn't say something to her, that might be enough to denounce her. The best course of action was to do nothing, because that was the least dangerous thing. People would cross the street when they saw her coming down. They later estimated that she's responsible for the death of about 6,000 people.
There are two thoughts that run through my mind when I'm hearing those kind of stories. And the first thought is just trying to comprehend the brutality of living in a time like that, and feeling, but just by listening to the story, feeling my own drive and will almost be stripped away just from secondhand, like your soul, your very soul being scraped away from you by hearing those stories.
That's a great adjective.
But what I can't help but do, and because we've talked about this before the interview about humans being narrative creatures, is that my brain is immediately linking narratives and things that I see today, things that I've seen in literature. Obviously, you're talking about these apartment level rats. The character Wormtongue,
sure,
from The Two Towers, comes into play. Mm-hmm. The conniving, sneaking fiend of Rohan. Mm-hmm. But the points today that I've thought about are really rooted in what is not so subtly Marxist. And often it's called it's conspiracy theory to call this Marxist, but it's in a lot of the diversity, equity, and inclusion style social rantings in which you are supposed to say the right things at the right time, or the mob comes after you. And I think of the authors who were solidly on the side of this movement until they said the wrong thing accidentally, on purpose, whatever. And then being ostracized is the least of your worries at this point. And that kind of fear has caused, I can't tell you how many teachers that I've talked to that were on the cusp of revealing something really disturbing in their school, but they were scared stiff, scared silent. And I'm just, what pops into my head, whether for good, for bad, whether it's justified, whether, I'm not trying to be dramatic. That's what pops into my head when you talk about her walking into the restaurant, everyone just going silent and looking at their plates and not moving, because of the pure abject terror of being thrown out, of being shot immediately, right? And your family tortured, who knows what else. I was going to ask you when the interview started, why talk about this today? I mean, obviously there's the geopolitical conversation to be had. There's the history of Putin. There's the history of Lenin, and there's the case against communism. But culturally, I was going to ask you why this series now and today?
Because,
and I think that you've answered it.
Well, I
by all means, you can certainly summarize. Please go right ahead. I'm just saying, as far as that, for the case for me, that's closed.
I had a number of motivations. One of them was that I didn't like the idea that you could be a student and walk around a campus in the United States of America and wear the hammer and sickle. You would never wear a swastika t-shirt, but you can wear a hammer and sickle t-shirt. They killed 70 times as many people as the Nazis. Not like we're keeping score. But my point is, they're both reprehensible totalitarian murder states. So why are we enjoined to never forget one and never remember the other? That was one aspect of it. But a bigger aspect of it for me was watching what was starting to happen here in America. That's why I decided to concentrate on the terror aspect, on how you control a population through fear. Now, this is a bit of a complicated answer, but it's important to understand where we are as Americans today. If you do the math, the number of SS employed by the Nazis was probably around 90,000 at its peak. And the number of Waffen SS, or the ones that were involved in the actual death camps and executions, was probably 40,000. The number of people who actually kicked down doors and took Jews off to trains and so on was probably closer to 25 or 30,000 total soldiers. All right, now, that 20, 30,000, 40,000 evil men murdered 6 million Jews, plus another 6 million homosexuals and gypsies and all the rest of it. So how did they do it? If every single Jewish family had been armed, for example, you would have run out of 40,000 SS guys a lot sooner than you would have run out of 6 million Jews. You'd have dead 40,000 SS guys, and if it was 1 for 1, you'd still have 5,960,000 living Jews. So an unarmed population is susceptible to physical terror. The founders understood that the primary coercive force of the government is legalized violence. And so they made sure that the violence could be vested in the American people as a deterrent to. People keep saying, "Oh, you're saying we're going to have to fight your government with your AR-15s?" No, it's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying because we have AR-15s and other weapons, we don't have to fight our government. They can't do it. They know they can't do it. So if they cannot intimidate the American people through actual murder, as they did in the Soviet Union and in Nazi Germany, they have to think of another way to do it. And the way that they do it is through the destruction of your character. Now, we live in a far more civilized time than the 1930s and 40s. We don't have to worry, at least not yet, and I don't think we'll ever really have to worry about about speaking up and having the result being either thrown in jail or having somebody come into your house and take you away in a car, because we're prepared for that option. And since they know that we're prepared for that option, they have to go about it differently. So what they use is the most powerful psychological mechanism that exists in human beings, and that mechanism is called social proof. That's what psychologists call it. You and I call it peer pressure. The reason that social proof is so effective is this. One of the reasons that the Russian people lived in terror was because the people who had the courage to stand up against them, the same is true for the Nazis, were killed. And so you have the example that if I speak up, I'm going to get killed too. And if you do this enough, by the way, in the Soviet Union, they executed people by quota. Stalin simply wrote an article, wrote an order and said, we suspect 750,000 anti-Soviet agents living in Yekaterinburg. Execute 750,000 people. And the people responsible for the executing didn't want to be executed themselves. So they would write back, Comrade Stalin, we didn't just find 75,000. We're so incredibly good at our jobs. We found 250,000. Execute all of those too. So this thing accelerates, right? But over time, Tony, you actually remove it from the gene pool. People who have the courage to speak up are actually taken out of it. It's a biological thing as well as a social thing.
Disagreeableness.
Right. So back to America. They can't put us in jail. Well, not until January 6th. They couldn't anyway. But they basically know that they cannot come and kick our doors down. So what can they do? They can destroy our lives. They can make us unemployable. They can make us despised by people who don't know you and questioned by people who do. And one of the things that's most astonishing to me about cancel culture, I'm a conservative and I have a number of relatives who are liberals. And I've had, like most conservatives, I've had this happen to me. I've had people who I've grown up with think that Rachel Maddow knows more about me than they do. And,
right.
and her opinion of me, or her opinion of what she thinks I am, is the one that they go with. And it's because of the power of social proof. So the great example about social proof is the Emperor's New Clothes. And I want to tell that tale again because people are missing the essential point of the Emperor's New Clothes. For those of you unfamiliar with it, it's a very old parable, and it goes something like this. A team of two tailors who are con men decide that they're going to get rich because there's an emperor who's a rather stupid fellow. And so they go to the court of this emperor and they say to this emperor, Your Majesty, after many years of hard work and study and all sorts of arcane interests in the East, we've managed to weave a material that is so incredibly beautiful that only the very virtuous and the very smart can see it. That is what we've accomplished. And the emperor says, my goodness gracious, I cannot wait. Good Lord. He says, we'd like to make a suit of this for you, sir, because you're the greatest emperor who has ever graced this fine country of ours. And the emperor says, well, by all means. So they bring out this bolt of cloth and they hold it up to him, and they're not holding up anything. Now, they have explained to him that the only people who cannot see this are the stupid and the evil, and he can't see it. So what does he do? He makes a decision to say, oh, well, it's even more amazing than I thought it could possibly be. I must have a suit of this. Name your price. And so these guys go in, they make a suit for the emperor made out of this invisible cloth. And when they bring it out to display it to him, he falls down. Everybody in the court has heard the story. Everybody in the court has heard that the only people that cannot see the cloth are the evil and the stupid. So when they unveil this thing, they immediately realize, my God, I can't see it, so I have to pretend. People understand that aspect of the social proof story, but what they don't understand is that nobody can see the cloth. So why does everybody believe it? Nobody can see the cloth, but everybody pretends that they can see the cloth. So you're the only person who thinks that you can't see the cloth. Dave sees the cloth, Susie sees the cloth, Martha sees the cloth. They're telling you how beautiful it is. They obviously see it. I don't. I'm all alone here. And so the story of the Emperor's New Clothes is a story of how each one of us sends social proof to the other, that we all agree about something that we know is not true. That's why the scam works. And what's especially interesting about this story is the end of the classical tale is the emperor now is going on a parade. Now the entire town has heard of it, his entire kingdom. So there's this giant parade, and the emperor is parading down this parade on a horse, and he's in his underwear. And everybody has heard that he's made this incredible suit of clothes that can only be seen by the virtuous and the wise. And everybody's applauding. Nobody sees it. Everybody sees everybody else applauding and thinks I'm the only one. Everybody in that entire parade thinks they're the only one that doesn't see it because everybody else is sending out signals that they see it. So they send out signals too. And at the end of the tale, a little boy says, he's not wearing any clothes because the boy's not old enough yet to understand the repercussions of being ostracized by society. And here's what's especially fascinating about that story. When the boy says, that he's not wearing any clothes. The villagers don't rise up and tear the king to pieces, the emperor. They don't shred the emperor. They don't get angry. They laugh. They all laugh. Even the emperor laughs. Everybody laughs because they realize how this illusion has been created and how this illusion owns them. So cancel culture is predicated on the idea that you agree with something that somebody is saying, but you know that that person is going to get in trouble for it. So you send out signals that say, oh, I don't agree with him. My God, he's a fascist. And so everybody is actually thinking the same thoughts and nobody is willing to admit it. No one's going to stand up and say, I'm the only idiot, apparently, who can't see the cloth. And it takes a person of either great moral courage or a great degree of unsophistication, somebody with purity of vision to simply say, no, I don't see that. To give it just to put this issue completely to bed for you.
Yeah, Tim. No, keep going.
There's a psychological experiment that was done, and it's one of the most important psychological experiments ever. The subject walks into a room, and inside the room are 10 other people. The subject's been told that you're going to be one of 11. There's 11 other people. Subject's told that you're going to be one of 12 test subjects. Okay. And we're going to be doing an experiment on perception. And so what happens is this guy comes out and he's got a board and he's got two pieces of string. One's nailed on the top and one piece of string's nailed on the bottom. This piece of string on the top is noticeably longer than the piece of string on the bottom. He goes to the first test subject. He says, which one of these two strings is longer? The one on the top is longer, one on the top is shorter. And the guy in the first chair goes, well, the bottom one, obviously. Goes to the next person. Which one of these two strings is longer? The bottom one. Which one of these two strings is longer? Are you kidding? Well, the bottom one. Now, the person who's number 12 is the test subject. Persons 1 through 11 are part of the experiment. And so by the time you get to number 12, when you ask this person, which one of these two strings is longer, the long one on the top or the short one on the bottom, if 11 other people say the bottom one is longer, the chance of that person saying the bottom one is almost 100%. Almost 100%. What they find is, if you do that same experiment again, and of the other 11 people, 10 of them say that the bottom one is longer, but one person says, no, the long one is longer, then your chance of going along with it drops to 20%. So people, the thing that's remarkable about that is not just that the person is going along to get along, right? He's obviously doing that. If 11 other people say that what clearly is the shortest string is the longer one, then he's going to say that too to get along. But what's actually happening is inside that person's mind, that person's mind is thinking, there's something wrong with me. I mean, there's really something must be wrong with me. They're not just saying, okay, we're all lying together. They're thinking, these are very good actors, these other people. There must be something really wrong with me because I think the one on top is longer.
So to draw it back into so first of all, it comes to my mind, at least as far as that, because I love developmental psychological experiments. I think they're very captivating. And it draws me back to the tendency of humans when they are surrounded by those who are telling them differently to question the framework of reality around them. Goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, when the serpent looks at Eve and is like, well, did God really say that you can't eat from every tree?
Precisely.
And puts her back on her heels. But to bring it forward a little bit I'm really glad that you told one of my favorite fables here about just about the emperor's clothes, is that when the boy laughs and it ends in comedy. And I'm really glad that you brought that up because that gets omitted in like a lot of modern kind of like summaries, that everyone laughs because they see the folly of it all. And it reminds me, I kid you not, of comedians like Dave Chappelle. And I'm not a huge fan of Dave Chappelle.
But Dave Chappelle has been through something, and he's had a transformational experience. He's speaking real truth now.
So we're so alike in this way. We're getting ahead of our own horse's cart. The Dave Chappelle, who normally I find and had found in the past kind of vulgar, who kind of made observations that were just on the edge of saying things that you weren't supposed to say, kind of like Eminem alludes to in Slim Shady, right? Like, oh, I say things you're not supposed to say, things you'd only say inside, you joke with your friends inside your living room, that kind of a thing.
I love that song.
And oh yeah, I mean the harpsichord makes it. The best part though is seeing when Chappelle changed. And he made the joke about transgenderism and about, I think the way that he framed it was that he was talking about traditional gender roles, and all of a sudden it's okay to talk about gender roles regarding transgender because now everyone knows what acting like a girl is and acting like what a boy is. And his comedy's changed completely since then. And the number of people that were turned off in an instant by laughter, by jokes. And it's why I think that you're seeing, again, that article that just came out in Politico that's griping about Trump and being funny and, oh, humor's always been a mask for authoritarianism. And I had a segment on my show about this the other day about how the side or the group, realistically, not necessarily monolithic, but certainly a lot in behavior, that says marriage and nuclear family is white supremacist, that say fitness is an element of the far right and fascist and whatever, and that laughter now is bad and comedy is terrible, according to this Medium article and this Politico article, that these are not actually hallmarks of wisdom, that people are recognizing them as signs of bitterness, that, well, I'm not stupid and evil. I can see the clothes. So therefore the people laughing must be wrong.
Well, if you're laughing, you're not serious,
who are happy
right?
Must be wrong.
If you're laughing, you're not serious. How can you possibly laugh when the planet is dying? How can you possibly laugh when black people are being oppressed by white supremacy? How can you possibly laugh while the Palestinians are undergoing a genocide? How can you possibly? It's a sign of narcissism.
And then that group wonders, so heavily narcissist, exactly, why their rates of again, I'm pointing to that story that just came out in the Post,
suicide rate,
the suicide rate, depression, anxiety.
They're not allowed. Their own personal philosophy does not allow them to be happy, because if they're happy, that means that they're not paying attention to all of the injustice in the world. And this business about laughter being a tool of authoritarianism is about as wrong as you can be. They're often wrong, but they're usually anti-truth. You know, it's one thing to be wrong. It's another thing to be diametrically opposed to the truth. Laughter is the one thing that authoritarians fear. That's the thing that they fear. And a great example of this, by the way, I can tell the story relatively quickly. You can look at the decline of the level of terror from Stalin to Khrushchev to Brezhnev with the telling of these three jokes. I don't know if you remember that from the Cold War series. If you want me to waste my time on it, now, it's not really a waste of time.
Oh yeah, they're Yakov jokes, and you have to.
So here are the three jokes. During and just try to feel how the ambient level of terror goes down with each one of these three jokes. So here's the joke about Stalin. Stalin is giving a speech, and in the middle of the speech, somebody sneezes, and Stalin stops, and the room goes deathly silent because Comrade Stalin is clearly angry. And we know what happens when Comrade Stalin is angry. So Comrade Stalin looks up and he says, "Who sneezed?" Silence. Nobody says it. "I will know who sneezed. Who sneezed?" Nobody says a word. He says to his KGB guys, "Take everybody in the front row, stand up, shoot them all." Down they go. "Now, who sneezed? I must know who sneezed." Now everybody's just shaking with fear. "Second row, stand up," shoots them all. He says, "I will do this until there's nobody left in the room. Who sneezed?" And way in the back of the room, this guy waves his shaking hand, and he's like, "I did, Comrade Stalin, it was me. I am the one who sneezed during your speech." And Stalin says, "Gesundheit." And then he goes on with his speech. Okay, number one. Number two, Khrushchev is visiting a state farm. And he's a big fan of collective farms, and it's a collective pig farm, and they've got lots of big pigs there. And Khrushchev insists that this be on the cover of Pravda the next morning to show the rest of the Soviet Union how wonderful collectivism is. And so there's this picture of Khrushchev in the field. He's surrounded by all these pigs and so on, and they're going to run it on Pravda. But the editors of Pravda realize, my God, we've got a serious problem here. What are we going to do? How do we caption this photograph? We have to caption the photograph. Well, we can't say Comrade Khrushchev with pigs. We can't say Comrade Khrushchev proud of pigs. That could get us in trouble. What the hell do we do? They said, worry about this all night long. The next day, the photograph comes out on Pravda, and the caption is Comrade Khrushchev second from left. And then finally, Brezhnev, who was very fond of medals and so on, Brezhnev arrives one day at the Politburo meeting, and for once he doesn't have his medals. He's usually just covered with all of these medals that he's awarded himself, Hero of the Soviet Union twice and all the rest of it. And one of the people who works with him says, Comrade Brezhnev, why are you not wearing all your medals? And he looks down and he goes, "Oh, I left them on my pajamas." Now,
I love
Okay,
that one.
but
That one's my
you
favorite.
can feel it, right? The first one is about
Hmm.
executing people who disagree with me. The second one is about embarrassing Khrushchev and maybe getting into political trouble. The third one is just plain farce. And so this is what the Soviet Union feared. And this is what the Russians are so good at, is this dark, dark, dark humor. I'm married to a Russian woman, and I love Russian humor, because Russian humor is a way of winking at somebody and letting people know that you know what's going on, even though the level of terror is so high. For example, there's this one major, and he says, well, he's out at a zoo with a general in the Red Army. And the general says, well, look, a crocodile. There's a crocodile. A crocodile's a remarkable creature. The crocodile, of course, is a flying animal. And the major says, no, General, the crocodile can't fly. And he says, I am a general in the Red Army of the Soviet Union. And then the major says, you're right, General. The crocodiles fly, but they fly very, very low. And that's the wink, you see?
Hmm.
That's the wink that gets past the social proof. So back to the whole America thing. If we're now beginning to live in a society where people are afraid to speak their minds, and so they be
Right.
quiet. And what problem with that is if everybody is quiet, then those of us who are objecting to what we're hearing think that we're the only ones who are feeling this way. That's their objective. Their objective is to make sure that every single person who disagrees with them thinks that they are the only one. It's not just to terrify them into submission, because if you are terrified into submission, you send the social proof signal that
Hmm.
I agree with the state because I'm not speaking up against it.
Right. And so there's another documentary that again is meant for the youths. It's called "How the USSR Collapsed on Soviet TV." It's by a guy named Ordinary Things, and I've watched this I don't know how many times, because it has a very it just talks about all of the weird Soviet
I've seen a
television and
bunch of
about
it.
Swan
It's
Lake
fun.
playing
Yep.
on loops. Yeah, it's great. So he points out, and he doesn't comment on it, and I've thought about this quite a bit. At the end of the Soviet Union, when Chernobyl has kind of broken a bit of the glass, and more TV and more portable cameras are starting to go around, and it shows people, and in direct contrast to the Soviet Union when the TV and cameras first came out, as opposed to now, in which the modern Soviet anthem was filmed, people are smiling. And people never talk about how the more you saw on Soviet TV, people smiling, the quicker the Soviet Union fell. Because here you had miners that were
Mm-hmm.
striking, and they're deep down in the mountain, they're sitting there and they're just smiling and they're just joking with each other with that, again, that dark Russian humor that you talked about, that wink. And it tears down this
Because it's
terror
an
that
empire of
comes
terror,
with it.
and you don't smile in an empire of terror. Once
I
people,
wasn't trying to bring it to a
well,
full
I
circle,
was,
but
because
that's rather fitting.
that's really the entire point. If you show people smiling on Soviet television, that's the end of the Soviet Union, because that means
Mm,
that other people watching the television get the social proof that we don't have to be afraid anymore. And if we don't have to be afraid anymore, now we can start doing something about this system that has murdered all our relatives and put us in a state of perpetual
mhm.
poverty and inferiority. And so the the entire idea of the empire of terror is that this state is illegitimate. It's illegitimate, and the reason you know it's illegitimate is because they have to terrorize people in order to go along with it. If it was a legitimate system, if it really was what these colleges are teaching, the very best way to live, they wouldn't have to murder 20 million of their own people in order to keep the
Right,
rules. They wouldn't have
right.
to enforce speech restrictions on people who disagreed with them. If it was the best system in the world, they would
Then
welcome.
it would reproduce
Yes,
naturally.
if communism was if the socialist paradise was the way to go, they wouldn't have to have people living in terror, and they would welcome criticism because they'd have a better answer. The fact that they don't do either of those things is prima facie evidence that their system is illegitimate, and it's illegitimate because it's not only inhuman, it's anti-human, and the only way to enforce it is through terror. And the thing that is most amazing to me when I did the research was just how unpopular Lenin and the Bolsheviks actually were. Just how
Hmm.
there's 14% of the vote or something like this, much like the Nazis. They bullied their way into power, and once they were in power, they made it very, very, very clear that we are not going to tolerate dissent. Lenin talked about, this is why I keep going to source quotes from Lenin. For this is so people who think that Lenin and this whole thing was a great guy. Lenin said, we will not allow a free election to use the weapon of democracy against our revolution. The weapon of democracy.
That's why the Soviet anthem is such a farce. They always talk about Lenin being the will of the people. It's like, no. and the man's rolling around in his plastic box hearing you say that. I mean, well, probably not, because the man loved political lies directed that way.
If you really want to, if you want to go after a true Marxist who believes in that the Soviet Union was just the bee's knees, if you want to go after a real Marxist, a guy who really understands Marxism, the thing I discovered in the second episode was, and in order to take power in Russia, Lenin had about 10 days on the train when he was leaving Zurich and the Germans allowed him to travel through Germany during the war, because Lenin was a biological weapon that the German Imperial High Command deployed against Russia to get Russia out of the war. And during that train ride that took about 10 days, Lenin had to do something. He ended up calling it his April thesis, but he had 10 days. He's the principal disciple of Marxism. He's St. Peter. If Marx is Jesus, he's St. Peter. And
he's the embodiment of the movement.
And so in the 10 days that Lenin has to invert Marxism. He has to invert Marxist theory in order to gain power. He has to turn it on his head. He has to make everything that Marx predicted wrong. Marx was crystal clear about this. The communist revolution will come in industrialized societies because in order to have the Marxist revolution, you have to have a group called the proletariat. The proletariat are not lower class people. It's very specific. The proletariat are factory workers. That's what you need. You need factory workers to rebel, take over the factories, reclaim the means of production, and then run the factories for the good of the people.
And he ended up choosing the most agrarian economy in Europe.
He didn't choose. He was born Russian.
Was forced to.
The Tsar when the Tsar abdicated, there's a power vacuum. So he says to himself, I'm Russian, there's a power vacuum, I'm a revolutionary, I've been sitting in cafes for 15 years sipping coffee, I have to be there. So now what he has to do in 10 days is he has to invert Marxism. He has to go to the least industrialized nation in Europe, a nation that is 99% peasant and 1% proletariat, and have the fig leaf of Marxism to cover for his personal power grab. So what does he do? He's going into the place that St. Marx himself had said is the least likely place to have a not only least likely, it's impossible for there to be a communist revolution in Russia because Russia has no proletariat. So Marx is wrong if Lenin wants power. So now Lenin has some serious thinking to do. And unfortunately, he's got 10 days. So what Lenin basically does is he says this. He says, well, Marx was right. You need a proletariat, but here's what we're going to do. Here's why we can have Marxism in Russia. The peasants don't have the political awareness to form the proletariat. They don't have the political awareness to lead the revolution. They're just stupid Russian peasants. He had nothing but contempt.
Orwell goes on about this in 1984.
He had nothing but contempt for his own people. He says, but a small cadre of professional revolutionaries can instill class consciousness onto the peasantry to the degree that we will begin to get communism, and then those peasants will become proletarians as time goes on. So,
the Marxist version of the Western 3% ideology.
So he completely inverts Marxist theory in order to gain personal power. That's who Lenin was, and Lenin gave away half of Russia at the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. He gave away half of it. He gave away 83% of his country's coal production. You're trying to build an industrial society. You gave away 83% of your coal production because your revolution was more important than anything. You would have done anything, you wouldn't have done anything to save the Russian people. You wouldn't have done anything even to save communism. You would have done anything to save your revolution. You are the state. There is no state without Lenin. Lenin is simply issuing orders, and that's the government. He's a dictator. He's a power-hungry freak. He had no connection to humanity. He had no friends. He had no family. He had no kids, nothing. That giant forehead of his was filled with theory, And he spent the 15 years prior to taking over this nation having discussions of, well, you're more of a Zinoviev really than a Bukharinist, and you're more of a left SR rather than a right SR.
Right.
Theory, and none of it had anything to do with reality, which is why you cannot let intellectuals run a country. Tony, you just can't do it, because an intellectual.
You're itching into my Robert Heinlein Starship Troopers territory.
An intellectual is the only person smart enough to convince himself that he's smarter than 300 million people combined. Nobody else is that stupid. You have to be a special kind of brilliant to convince yourself of something that is that clearly, obviously wrong.
Well, I've never let my schooling get in the way of my education, as good old Samuel Clemens used to put so eloquently.
And speaking of Samuel Clemens was writing in a series of essays he did that weren't published till after his death. It was called Letters to the Earth, where he was writing as a tool, as a devil on Earth to Satan, who's about to take over Earth. Here's what's going on the planet, And he said, now these humans have the one weapon that could destroy our entire plan, speaking for the devil. And they're too stupid to realize it. And he said, that weapon is laughter. Against the assault of ridicule, nothing can stand, he said.
Oh, it's such a perfect circle, but I would be beyond remiss if I did not get your reaction to this. And it was going through my mind the entire time that I was listening to season 1 and 2. How much do you savor, as just a common historian guy, the poetic justice of Boris Yeltsin being the final figureheadish in a way kind of linchpin in Lenin's vision, the drunk goofball who played the spoons as the humor just stuffed goober who ended up taking over and crossing the Soviet Union into the Russian Federation?
There's obviously, once Stalin died, the fear level begins to decrease. They're no longer murdering people now. They're sending them to the gulag. What they would do is they would say the person has been sentenced to 10 years without the right of correspondence, which meant that you're not going to get any letters from this person from 10 years. So don't start a revolution. Come looking for all your missing relatives. We're just not allowing them to write for 10 years. They've been dead for 4 years, but that's and people will cling to hope, right? There's, and I don't mean to single anybody out, but there are still some people who are still praying that somehow, Malaysian Flight 370 landed somewhere and their relatives are still alive somewhere. Maybe they're in prison camps. You know what I mean?
The mother waiting by the window for
this
her
is
son
what
to
is
come
so terrible
home.
about
Absolutely.
being declared missing in action as opposed to killed in action. If you're killed in action, you can begin to grieve and closure and all the rest of it. If you're missing in action, you never ever completely close the door on hope. And
the empty coffin is the empty heart. Absolutely.
And so you've got this entire thing where people are being sent away instead of murdered and disappearing. They're just being sent away, and you're hoping they're all being worked to death in a place called Kolyma, where they killed 800,000 people. But as the Soviet system begins to unravel and it becomes less and less efficient, and the natural corruption, you see, here's the funny thing. People actually do care more about themselves than they do care about other people. And people do want to better themselves. And when you've got a political system like communism where you're not allowed to do that, at least not publicly, then people will find a way to better themselves. Honest people will do things like the black market. They'll work harder and sell things. That's the only honest thing for honest people to do. What most people will do is they'll try to embed themselves into the system and enrich themselves by enforcing the system that allows nobody else to get rich. So this is why so many...
I saw that in public schools all the time. As a guy who, in administration, the temptation to participate in embezzlement and bribery in Indianapolis public schools was overwhelming. It's one of the reasons I hated being there. I thought I was going to fail.
It's like a bank that leaves its money out in sacks outside the front door and says, do not touch.
Or like when my sister's the banker in Monopoly. Some things just don't work out.
But so what ends up happening is that corruption becomes so endemic that people lose faith in the system, and they lose faith that they're going to be punished for going against the system. And then it collapses. And as we saw it collapsed, it's that old saw, how did it happen? Slowly at first and then very quickly. That's the definition of a tipping point phenomenon, where things start to roll a little bit and then whoop, off it goes. That's how corrupt systems fall. But we're seeing so many of the same mechanisms that governed the Soviet Union being employed in the United States. I didn't say the outcomes, I said the mechanisms. The review, the refusal to hear a differing opinion, just the absolute silencing of critics, the shaming and the destruction of people who are against the official opinion of whatever that might happen to be. And especially, most especially, the one thing that these systems require, the communists required it, the Nazis required it, and the progressives require it. And that is, they require an enemy who is responsible for their own failures. In the Soviet Union, it was, when you kill all of the engineers because they have educations and they're likely to rebel against you, then you have railroads that are run by people who aren't engineers. And when you have 60,000 accidents on one railroad line in 1 year, which is what happened in 27 or 28 or so, 60,000 railroad accidents on one railroad line in 1 year. Well, how are you going to explain that? It can't be the incompetence of the state because the state is infallible. Has to be wreckers was the term they came up with. Saboteurs, secret capitalists, foreign powers, enemy agents at work. And so you have
to be fair, Bill, I'm sure that Boeing will find a way to explain the train accident.
I have no doubt, but Boeing's not the problem.
No,
the communists had to have spies, wreckers, and saboteurs in the employ of capitalists, led by the chief of the capitalists, Leon Trotsky. Because
absolutely.
So there's that. The Germans obviously had the Jews. And what we're seeing now with the progressives is the demonization. They tried to demonize all Republicans, couldn't quite get away with it because most people know some Republicans. So the demonization of MAGA Republicans these are the enemies that must be fought. And if we have to, even if we have to lie about them, it's only because the only reason we might be lying about how evil this one person is because the threat is so dangerous that we must use all means at our disposal in order to protect you from this oncoming apocalypse. The reason,
hence the elevation. Oh, I'm sorry.
No. This is a conversation.
Sorry about that. I just keep thinking of the rise, again, as a forensic writer and commentator, the rise in qualitative evidence versus quantitative evidence, and the idea that, well, in racial equity courses, when they don't actually show, well, these are the number of individuals who experience discrimination at the DMV. They say these are the number of people who say they felt discriminated against at the DMV, because it's the feeling of the individual that matters. And you say, well, but no one at the DMV, we all hate the DMV. No one likes going to the DMV. It doesn't mean you were discriminated. Well, it's because of their lived experiences that you can't understand, that they feel this way. Therefore, that truth is relevant. And that comes very, very similarly to how the East German Stasi actually advocated for the individual reporting systems that they maintained, was that, well, I don't live in this portion of Dresden. So if a citizen in Dresden says that they recognize a capitalist sympathizer, then we're going to send a team to investigate. And it's such an old song played over again and again.
And they play it over and over again because it still works. Why do you think it is? If you were to take the murder rate of American cities out of the American equation, I did a video on this called Number One with a Bullet. If you were to take the top 20 murder cities in America out of the U.S. statistics, just remove those numbers from the U.S. statistical base, the murder rate in the United States is lower than Switzerland. It's lower than Belgium. It's lower than Ireland. It's astonishing. So the real question is, why is it that we have these murder pits where 8,000 Americans are murdered every year by other Americans, mostly young black men murdering other black men? Why is this tolerated? Why does this happen? Well, you find out that places like Baltimore haven't had a Republican mayor for 70 or 80 years. I think Atlanta now is at 140 years or something like this. Put the politics aside. Put the labels aside. These living hells. P.G. O'Rourke, who did Vacations in Hell and went to the worst places in the world. He went to Haiti. He went everywhere. He said, "I've never been so scared as I was at a public housing project in Philadelphia. That's the most terrified I've ever been." Why did they allow this to happen? Why do people keep voting for this? Why does this endless cycle of violence and poverty and crime continue? It continues because the Democrats in those cities have managed to convince the voters that the Republicans are somehow going to be even worse. And
right, it's my fault here in Indiana that there's gun violence in Chicago because it is theoretically easier to buy firearms in Indiana than it is in Chicago. So obviously I'm a trafficker on the side.
So yes, everything that we've done as Democrats, your life may be miserable, but we do continue to give you the paychecks. We give you the lowest possible amount of money to live on. We give you the worst housing. We give you the worst public transportation. We humiliate you on a daily basis by having to beg for everything. But we're not as bad as the Republicans. And when you own the media and you own the message, you can sell enough people on that idea. Although I genuinely have to say that now all across the board, I'm seeing signs that people have just had enough of this, because unlike most political pundits, I don't listen to other political pundits. I listen to gaming channels. I watch a lot of body cam videos of police arrests. I throw a real wide intelligence net because a lot of things interest me. And when I see a video about something that I think is interesting politically, the first thing I do is check the comments. I want to know what other people think about these things.
Absolutely.
And there is a reluctance now among people in this country to abide by the rules of terror that have been laid down by the entire idea of cancel culture. When you say you're canceled, that's functionally equivalent to you're killed. We're joke about cancel culture because it's got a nice soft, kind of a nice American soft sort of a, oh, well, it's just a cancellation. It's not, no, you're killed.
Yeah, it's a very cuddly
it's
euphemism,
the death of
isn't
you.
It? For the,
if you,
I mean, again, I can't work in public education. I mean, I probably
you're
could
a teacher,
point, but I mean, for
you
what,
want to be a teacher. You left West Point because you wanted to be a teacher, and now you can't teach because of your political opinions. Your career has been killed. You've been executed. The person you wanted to be has been murdered by this system, and that is what they're doing, and they're doing it to everybody, and everybody's afraid of it. And the only way to deal with it is to do what you're doing right now and to stand up and just be the little boy saying, this is ridiculous. This thing has no clothes. It's a joke. These people that are doing this are not criminal masterminds, and they're not ruthless, murderers. We're being subjected to the rule by weenies, cowards, lunatics, neurotics, power-hungry narcissists. These are the people that are controlling our society because we are afraid of calling them what they are.
And when you do call them what they are, and I think this is kind of probably a good point to end on, much to the relief of the listeners, is again regarding the whole controversy in banning TikTok. I want to pivot off of a comment that Trump made that he didn't want TikTok banned because he didn't want Meta, Facebook and Instagram, to be elevated because he called it the enemy of the people. And I don't disagree with his concept of Meta and the organization as a whole. But I do have a point that runs counter to that in that forensic style. And that is the comment sections in the reels and videos and posts of Instagram, which are more conservative and heap more humor-laden scorn on the nonsense than I've ever seen on Twitter, than I've ever seen on probably any place other than 2008, 2009 4chan, really, to date some of the older internet jokes there. And it's because it's still a site that's governed by usernames and not first names and last names. And so people that are stripped of that emperor's clothes, social proof, as you talked about, are just heaping scorn on the silliest ideas, and within that ends up coming the lifting up of values and virtues, and again in the weirdest ways. And that's on a platform that is supposed to be, no matter how hard I see that algorithm trying to push one political side,
signal will get through. Joe Biden's Instagram page, the comments in Joe Biden's Instagram page look like they were written by the world's biggest drunken tea party group. I mean, it's so relentlessly mocking, and
it's so much worse than his Twitter. And Twitter's supposed to be the right-wing cesspool.
Yes, so that's the actual voice of the people speaking out. So just to wrap this up in terms of the empire of terror, I felt two things very, very strongly. One of them was that somebody had to speak for these 20 million people who were killed by the system, which nobody talks about, and which people are still trying to sell to the American people. And the second thing is, I wanted to show people the factual reality of what the end result of not speaking up leads to. The end result of you being quiet will eventually and always lead to this kind of terror. And I would rather be fighting against people who are just a bunch of narcissistic control freaks, rather than a bunch of narcissistic control freaks who've managed to convince people with guns to come after us because we don't have our guns anymore, that kind of thing. It's not happening here. And there's no way to equate cancel culture with the execution of 20 million people, but the dynamics are the same. The signals are the same. The methods are the same.
The mechanisms are the same.
And so it is a cautionary tale for people to see what happens when people who disagree with the system don't speak up.
Bill Whittle, the Daily Wire's What We Saw. And again, season 1 was the triumph of Apollo 11. Season 2 was Cold War tensions. And season 3, an empire of terror, where it came from, what it means for today. I cannot recommend this enough. And Bill, thanks for just coming on and chatting with me for about an hour here. This was
I have to tell you, Tony, I just love talking about these things. I love talking to you. And of all the people I interview, you get these pop references so much more than I do. So we should do a pop culture show. I'd really look forward to that a lot.
Well, I'll tell you what, we'll go ahead and write something in the books. Thank you guys for listening. That has been this kind of a longer podcast episode on the Tony Kinnett Cast. You can find the full video up over at the Daily Signal. Thank you very much.